Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's mini lesson. Last week, you had a chance to do some reverse outlining. Reverse outlining is a great tool for analyzing something that's already been written, especially if you want to understand how it's been put together or the structure of how it flows. It's useful for evaluating other people's work, but it's also really useful for you to use to evaluate your own work and make sure that your structure is put together in the way you expect it is. For this 2-week module, I'm actually only going to do one mini lesson, and you'll see why. Originally, the first week I was going to be talking about outlining, and the second week I'd talk about reading like a writer. However, the two really go hand in hand and they can't be separated. So here's a quick overview of how this mini lecture is going to be structured. First, I'm going to talk about what it means to weave your writing together to create coherence and cohesion. And then I'll talk a little bit about outlining from a theoretical perspective as a tool that facilitates cohesion and coherence. And then finally, I'm going to show 3 different ways to do some outlining that might be different from the way that you were taught back in high school or middle school or even college. And that's where those Kraken and Legos come in. So we'll take a look at those in a bit. It's really critical that chapter 1 of your dissertation is both coherent and cohesive, because it sets the context of your dissertation for your reader and tells the reader how they should make sense of the rest of the writing to come. Either you do this in chapter 1, or they are left to do the sense making on their own. And you really don't want the reader to be doing that, both because it can be confusing, but also because they can misinterpret the takeaways that you're trying to develop in your dissertation and the research that you're sharing and how you're interpreting the research. So you're setting that up, laying that out so that they can anticipate and kind of have in their mind what they should be looking for as they're reading the rest of the dissertation. Coherence is the broad organizational structure of your chapters so that it builds and flows toward a singular or connected set of takeaways or arguments. In this case, we've been talking about how chapter 1 is really laying the argument that for why this dissertation should exist. Hopefully you were able to see the coherence or the golden thread emerge from the exemplar chapter that you reversed outlined for last week. And at the same time are reflecting on how to make the structure of your own chapter 1 flow coherently. Traditionally, when we're creating an outline, we are focused on coherent organization or building our argument and the main points that need to have coherence between one another. And that's true. Outlining is an important tool for organization in a broad way. But I also want you to be thinking of organization as a tool for clarification. Perhaps you've seen a theme emerge in these mini lessons. I talk a lot about how do we get our writing unstuck, or in our case, untangled from our Gordian knot. When we're really working with complex ideas, writing about them is both a process of clarifying those ideas for ourselves as much as it is a process for writing in a way that makes sense to the reader. This is referred to as internal cohesion, and constantly searching for that in our own writing is what I mean when I talk about writing like a reader. When we're outlining for cohesion, we're not just trying to figure out what goes where, but also to help clarify the relationships between ideas for ourselves so that we can make them explicit to our reader. To that end, before I talk about the example outlines that I've created, which are different types from your basic topical or hierarchical outline, I do want to talk about the common ways that ideas tend to relate to each other in expository writing. So one of the biggest relationships you'll see in expository writing is something called a correlation or causation. They're two different things, and you need to be careful about using those words interchangeably. However, correlation or causation can be a simple cause and effect, or an amalgamation of situations or phenomena that occur together to create a new phenomena. And phenomenon, again, are what you are studying. In that case, you need to be explicit about how each element also has an impact on the other. And the common phrases you'll see in writing that show either causation or correlation are things like "for that reason" or "therefore." Again, be careful with causation, because unless you can isolate the variables and you run a double-blind study with your control, you can get pinged for claiming causation rather than correlation. So another way to show relationship is through chronology. Chronology can refer to the sequence of events that occur in a time frame, or it can refer to a sequence of concepts that need to be understood in a particular order. So we often see terms like subsequently, simultaneously, or following to show the relationship of chronology. Another type of relationship is part to whole. And that's when you break down a concept or a phenomenon or theory into its constituent parts. Often we refer to those, especially in a theoretical framework, as constructs. And phrases you might see that show part to whole are things like additionally or furthermore. Another type of relationship is the contrast. We use contrast to clarify a concept, a theory, an idea by pointing out its differences with something that people might be more familiar with. We might see things like "however," "on the contrary," or "at the same time" as common phrases to show contrast. And the sister to that is similarity, which is clarifying ideas or concepts by pointing out similarities with something that is more familiar to the reader. We see things like "likewise" or "in a similar fashion" to show that type of relationship. And then we talk a little bit about importance, which is demonstrating the hierarchy of ideas or concepts. You might see phrases like "foundationally" or "critically." And of course, you all are familiar with things like an illustration or example, which is using a particular instance of a general concept or phenomenon to make it more concrete or easier to understand, something that the reader can connect to. You might see phrases like "specifically" or "to illustrate" to indicate that there is a illustration or example following the concept or the more abstract concept or idea that you've just shared. And that's how I want you to write like a reader. I want you to continuously be asking yourself, how do these ideas relate to each other? How can I explicitly show cohesion internally within my paragraphs or ideas? And I also want you to be thinking about coherence. How does what I'm writing relate back to the main points or the main organizational structure that I am trying to build? Let's talk a little bit about some different types of outlines you can use to help you parse out those relationships. Traditionally, we tend to be taught that outlining, we tend to be taught that outlining is topical and linear, meaning topic 1, topic 2, topic 3. And that's what I did, and probably what you did when you were putting together your reverse outline. And that's fine. But if you find that you're getting all tied up in your logic, organizing your ideas topically and linearly, at least from the get-go, doesn't always help you see the relationships between the complex ideas. AKA, it can be harder to see the cohesion between the ideas. And you might find yourself in that same situation if you are using Edgewood's dissertation template as a tool to construct your outline, rather than a reference point or something that you can use to put your writing back together later once you've got those concepts clarified. That's in no way, shape, or form to say that topical or linear outlines won't work for you. I just want you to consider other ways of outlining in case you get stuck. Let's take a look at a few examples of what I mean. One way to set up your outline is around questions. Let me share with you a research project I'm currently working on with a few other co-authors. What we're trying to do is figure out a way to pull out and measure the emotional labor tasks that are implicit but expected in teaching and higher education. Here's the main question we're trying to unpack. What tasks like emotional labor, ensuring student well-being, and supporting student services are educators implicitly expected to perform? The first outline I'm going to show you based off of questions is a more linear one, but rather than using topics and subtopics, I'm going to use questions and sub-questions. So let's take a look at these. I start out by parsing my main research question. What tasks like emotional labor, ensuring student well-being, and supporting student services are educators implicitly expected to perform? And I'm parsing that by saying, what are the parts of this main question that I need to address? And I'm going to say, the first part of that is, what are the tasks? And the second part of that is, why are educators implicitly expected to perform those tasks? So the first chunk that I'm going to be outlining based on questions starts with, how should those tasks be explicitly defined? And then I go further down and ask the question, does emotional labor fully encompass those tasks? Because the theoretical framework we're thinking about is emotional labor. The next level down, again, showing relationship, showing how these things relate based on hierarchy, is how was emotional labor as a theoretical framework defined by Hochschild? And then as a subset of that, a sub-question of that is, has this been applied in higher education? And if so, a subset of that is by whom? So we're going from broader to more specific. And then I want to take a look, kind of do another contrast here. And I'm asking myself, is there more out there? So the second sub question is, are there other terms or definitions that align or are adjacent to emotional labor? And one of the things we are exploring, so a sub question of this, is how is academic momism related to emotional labor? And we are still not answering that question about making these tasks explicit. So a subset of that question might be, what specific tasks are included in an academic momism that extends the definition of emotional labor in higher education? Which leads us to something a little bit broader, a more broad question, or point 3, are these frameworks explicit enough? Point in our conversation, you've been listening to me talk long enough, so I'm actually not going to go over the next main topic that would be in our research project. I will point it out. Why are higher education educators implicitly expected to perform those tasks? And then I outline those with those subtopics. All right, everyone, I'm going to show you this outline laid out a bit differently. In fact, I'm using a mind mapping tool instead of a linear outline to help me make sense of how these relationships are being put together. How are things related? I know this looks like a hot mess. I get it. This is where the term Kraken comes from, because it looks like a Kraken with many multiple scary tentacles. But let's zoom in a little bit further. You can see here. Let's zoom in and see how this is really working. So I'm starting with our main question: what tasks like emotional labor, ensuring student well-being, and supporting student services are educators implicitly expected to perform? And then I've broken this up into sub-questions again. You saw 2 of these already. How should these tasks be explicitly defined? Why are educators expected to perform those tasks? What are perceived and explicit external forces? A little bit further down, we've got this other sub-question. How do those expectations and forces change based on educator demographics, personal characteristics, professional hierarchy, and training? And then we're moving further out. How does this work impact educators? So we call those the consequences. And then how can this work be quantified, or is another sub-question. And what should be done to support educators in this work? So our big project will be answering all of these questions. Let's dig a little bit further into this though. I want to start with this question over here. Why are educators expected to perform those tasks? So that's our sub question. And we're going to pull, and I want to pull this apart. And so I'm asking yourself, what are these reasons for it? And one reason might be the commoditization of higher education. And in this graphic, I am actually going ahead and adding on the resources or the references that I want to be using to make this sub point. Another one might be, another answer to this question might be academically entitled students or entitled students. And again, here's the references that I've already pulled to talk about this reason why instructors are expected to perform these types of tasks. And another one might be intrinsic motivation or the effective commitment or teacher attitudes that might be impacting this. And along with that is another sub-idea called care ethics. So this belongs within this concept. And again, connecting those to the references that I'll be using. So that's just another way to lay that out and show how things belong together, how they fit together. And I could turn these, although maybe not as explicitly as I did in the linear outline, into their own paragraphs. In case you're curious, the tool I'm using for this is a tool called Coggle. And Coggle's free for your first 3 Coggles. I like it so much that I actually bought a monthly subscription. It's not very much money, but it's something I use to help me parse my thoughts out a little bit further. All right, now we're looking at another tool. This is called Jamboard. It is part of Google's suite of tools, and it is a collaborative whiteboarding software. In this case, I am using the Post-it note or sticky note part of the application. And you could do this physically as well if you have a big space or board, or make a big space somewhere where you can use sticky notes to cluster or show relationships. I should say that both of these examples are both of the visual examples are what are known as cluster maps, and show how things cluster together and how they relate to one another. So again, we have this main question. And again, I'm breaking this down for this example into to 2 topics. We've got the types of tasks that I'm going to plop over here. And then I have, instead of asking questions about what causes this, I have just said causes of phenomena. And you can see here how I parsed the main topic question. So first, I want to look at why this is implicit. And second, I might want to talk about the types of tasks that are performed. I actually don't know what would go first. In the linear outline, I put types of tasks first, causes of phenomena first. But now that I'm looking at it, I might say, actually, I want to talk about why this phenomena exists, and then talk about the types of tasks that we know about, which might lead into a research question. What types of tasks do we not know about? How do we make them explicit? So by doing this, I'm working out some of that logic. You can see that one of the topics I've already touched on is this concept of emotional labor, or the theoretical framework of emotional labor. And if you read Hochschild's work, it's built on 3 constructs rather than writing them there, just they're there. And that is visual, or that is made, those constructs are made apparent through something called, the Hochschild calls deep acting and surface acting. And then I've got these green things, these green Post-it notes in here that remind me to answer some questions. So I might say, hey, it would be a great place to put an example of what this looks like in higher education practices. And again, I'm wondering, are there other theoretical frameworks or sub-frameworks that might relate to Hochschild's broader framework? And we are looking at this concept of something called academic momism. And I'm reminding myself down here, let's go find some examples here. So by doing this, these 2, I'm answering this, how do we make them explicit? How do we pull them out? And then I'm over here, I'm asking this question, do certain tasks have different reasons for occurring? And what is that relationship? So even though I might not have defined that, I'm thinking like I'm writing like a reader, or I'm outlining like a reader, and thinking about the questions, anticipating the questions that readers might have. So causes of the phenomena, you saw those laid out in the Kaggle mind map before, or cluster map. There are 4 that we might actually focus on, which is organizational socialization, academic entitlement, commoditization of higher education, and effective commitment. And on the last map, you saw that this concept of care ethics was also a subset of effective communication. So for this week's assignment, you are going to be putting an outline together of your first chapter. And it could be however you want to do it. It could be a way that you use already. It could be one of the tools that I showed you. It could be a topical outline, a reverse outline, a question-based outline. Those are all legitimate. The point is that I want for you to start thinking about coherence and cohesion in your own writing. So I look forward to seeing those. Whatever format will work best for you to achieve those 2 goals, coherence and cohesion. Otherwise, have a great week, and we will be talking next week.